he's not just a soldier, he's a sailor. He produces very good mezzotint engravings. He's a very good artist. He's a scientist. He produces inventions, noiseless muskets, applications that could heal an incision to a pig's gut. He produces potions and lotions. Prince Rupert's drop, which is like a tadpole-shaped piece of glass. You hit one end, it doesn't shatter. You tap the other one, and it goes into powder. And that's something similar to car windscreens. How they are strengthened today. So all of these things, they keep him. You pick up a book about an aspect of the 17th century, the chances are that Rupert's contributed in some way to that.
Hello. On Sunday the 23rd of October 1642, at Edgehill during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, Parliament and the Royalists met on the field of battle. In an inconclusive engagement, both sides left the field largely intact, but one man's name would be known throughout England. Prince Rupert of the Rhine led a stunning cavalry charge on the king's right flank, breaking through the Parliamentarians. But as with so many cavalry charges, the thrill got the better of him, and he pressed his attack too far, thus threatening the infantry. Rupert's reputation grew, however. But who was this foreign prince? Mark Turnbull joins to discuss this brilliant soldier, sailor and Renaissance man. Mark has written a new book that has found new material, not easy in a crowded field. Plenty more history on the way, so please do share with friends and family. But until then, it's me talking Rupert of the Rhine with Mark Turnbull. Mark, great pleasure to have you on again. It's been a while, actually, but you've got a new book, Prince Rupert of the Rhine. But thank you for joining me.
Time flies when you have fun, Ollie. Thanks so much for having us back on the podcast.
A pleasure. And so this is very interesting because this is one of the most flamboyant characters of history, one could argue. And I guess he was always an attractive person for you to write about. But this is your second non-fiction book. So the first one being on Charles I's private life.
That's right. Yeah. And this was kind of a natural follow-on, really, personality-wise and biography-wise. After Charles, it had to be Rupert.
Yeah. Okay. For listeners who maybe some who will be familiar, others might not be. Who was he, I suppose, to start with? And what is it about him that makes such a compelling character for historians?
The first question's probably more straightforward. So he was one of 13 children. His father was the Elector Palatine and then later became the King of Bohemia. His father was Frederick. His grandfather was the Elector Palatine. His father's mother was Dutch, Juliana. And then on his mother's side, this is closer to home, we have Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, who was the daughter of James VI and First and Anna of Denmark. And so obviously there we've got Elizabeth, we've got her Elizabeth's father, who was Rupert's grandfather, James, was Scottish. And then his grandmother, through his mother's line, was Danish, so Anna of Denmark. So, yeah, bit of a mixed background.
Just to be clear as well, though, he's a Protestant.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, you've got this is all sort of a strong Protestant bond and sort of heritage. You've got James, who was brought up a Protestant, I suppose. So James is only recently, Protestant from birth. His mother was Mary Queen of Scots, Catholic. Anna of Denmark, she's Protestant. And then you've got the electors Palatine. They are Protestant leaders in what we'd say is Germany. They're called electors because they can elect the Holy Roman Emperor, the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick is chosen, Rupert's father is chosen for the Bohemian throne after they throw out the Catholic Emperor as their king. And they choose Frederick, who is Protestant, and that unleashes this religious war in Europe.
Yes, a particularly bloody religious war. But I guess so we should also make clear then what's interesting then is if his grandfather is James I and his mother is Elizabeth Stuart, then her younger brother is Charles I. So his uncle is Charles I, King of England.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And that's especially important when Rupert's father dies. So Frederick he goes on to lose the throne of Bohemia and the ancestral lands in the Palatinate. And Rupert, this is one of the key points about Rupert is he's the only child to be born in Bohemia. So out of the 13, he's the only one born in Bohemia. And you could say that he's the only one born to them while they were fully monarchs in their own kingdom before they were thrown out and ousted by the emperor. Why does he endure today? And I think there's so many angles. I think and this is what I came to in the conclusion of the book. What is it out of those 13 children that makes him stand out even today? People love him, they hate him. He's still that archetypal royalist hero. He's still the parliamentarian villain. People either like him or they hate him. But what I think most people agree on is that he is this flamboyant character. He does stand out from the pages of history. He endures today. He's a popular subject. People are fascinated by his story. And I think that comes down, you've got, on the one hand, if we segregate it out, we've got the propaganda. All of these parliamentarian news sheets, that title him Duke of Plunderland, Prince Robber, Mars of the Malignants, all of these titles.
And one of them is quite a recent moniker, isn't it?
It is, yes. So Dr. Jonathan Healy, so he called him an aristocratic thug in the Blazing World. So, he's still getting these monikers now, over, 400 years on. So you've got this propaganda and you've got the woodcut image of Rupert with the flames of Birmingham behind him, and then you've got the whole Civil War tales. On the one hand, you've got the negative propaganda, but then you've got the royalist propaganda, which, has him tales of Rupert sort of bribing an apple seller, putting the apple seller's clothes on, riding this cart full of apples into the parliamentarian army and selling these apples. And then he rides out, swaps clothes again with the apple seller and tells the apple seller to ride in and tell them how did they enjoy their apples that were sold by Prince Rupert. These tales. And historians do, there's a definite link with Gustavus II Adolphus, who also had these sort of folklore, these tales grow up about him, about these exploits. And people are still torn on whether there's any truth in them. There's another one that he dressed up as a woman. I mean, he was 6'4", very tall at the time, and he dressed up as a woman apparently and viewed the defences of London, these sort of antics. And there really could be some truth in some of them, yes. But it's this propaganda that just really catapults him out of the pages as this sort of lively, determined, abrasive character, and I liken him to Prince Philip. I think he's very much like that. He's a royal exile. He's brought up. He enters the military. He thrives in the military, just like Philip, and then he settles in Britain. And serves his adopted country, in every field, any field he can.
Yeah, so why is that? Because, as you say, I mean, he's got obviously the British connection. Why does he want to spend so much of his time? I mean, he's even in his teenage years, I think he spends in England, doesn't he?
Yes, and that's when his father dies. They really rely on Charles I in Britain, the three kingdoms of Britain, to be their saviour. He is that blood tie, which Rupert even pens in a letter to Charles in 1633. So Rupert is only 13, and he's writing to Charles saying, I want to grow up for your majesty's service. We only have this blood tie. We've got no money. We've just got this blood tie. And I think he looks on Charles as a bit of an idol, this king across the water, remote king who is their saviour, in because his father dies, Gustavus dies in battle. They die very, very within weeks of each other, and then they are reliant on Charles I. So I think he does idolize Charles, and then he visits England with his brother as a teenager, and that he really thoroughly enjoys his uncle's company. They are two kindred spirits. They're very chivalrous. They love outdoor pursuits. They're very energetic, curious minds. But in some ways, they're extremely different in their characters. Rupert is quite blunt, quite determined, quite ruthless, and Charles isn't. But the two of them, they really enjoy each other's company. And that's just a visit. But then after that, when they try, his brother tries to regain some of the lands, the ancestral lands in the Palatinate, Rupert joins the force. They're defeated and Rupert's captured. And it's Charles I who exerts the diplomatic pressure to have Rupert released. And Rupert, never forgets that. And he wants to pay his respects and his thanks to Charles. And that's how he ends up in Britain during the Civil Wars.
Right. So, yes. So he has this kind of emotional tie. Without Charles I, he wouldn't have got out of prison. So, yes. So he then does appear for the Civil Wars. Now, he didn't have... Okay, you're going to be angry with me here, but he doesn't seem to have much of a great military track record up to and even during the Civil Wars. Is that fair to say?
No, I don't think it is. But I'll explain why. I think his track record, he's judged on the later battles. So he's judged on Naseby for riding off the field. People read often that he charges off at Edgehill, smashes through the enemy cavalry, yes, on the wing of cavalry, but then goes off the field. He can't control his men. And that happens at Naseby. It happens at Marston Moor as well. So you can focus on that and say that he hasn't got a good track record. But I think what the military career is not just about those individual battles. It's not just about that action on the wing of the cavalry, the wings of the army. When you look at his entry into England, it's widely said that without him, the king would probably not have even managed to fight that civil war. So he comes over, he's outraged at the state that the king's in. You've got Hull closing its gates on the king. Coventry closes its gates and actually fires on the king. And the advisors at that point are counselling Charles to make concessions, because that's what he's been doing for over a year. And Rupert sees this and thinks, how is this happening? You've got an anointed monarch here. People are shooting at him. They are, they're really attacking him verbally, not just with bullets. And
that wouldn't be tolerated where Rupert's from.
Absolutely not. I mean, very, very different on the continent. Very bloody, bloodthirsty wars. But Rupert sees this and he says, this is not acceptable. It's got to stop. And he starts to be the royalist bad cop to King Charles's good cop. So he threatens the mayor of Leicester, for example, give a £2,000 loan, otherwise I'll appear before the town with an army. He's grabbing the pistol from putting a pistol against the head of the one of the leaders of the trained bands in Leicestershire, and saying, "Lay down your weapons."
So this is behaviour that Healy would describe as sort of thug-like from an aristocrat.
Yes. But what he's doing is he's pulling the king's cause up by the bootlaces. This is not acceptable behaviour. The king is far too gracious. His enemies are insolent with every concession he makes. And that's what Rupert says. And he really sort of gives the king's cause backbone. The people around him get backbone to stand firm. Stop giving in. Raise forces. He can't raise troops because the Parliamentarians, he's making concessions, and the king always sounds weak by making concessions. Parliament are gaining ground every single time with the concession. So men look at that and think, whose army am I going to join? Well, I'm not going to declare for the king because he'll back down. So you've got Parliament with 15,000, the king with barely 2,000. And then Rupert comes along and everything changes. So in terms of his military career, he goes from that point where he really pulls the Royalist cause up. He gets that confidence and that oomph into the cause. He drags the cause up, and he's got a lot of commanders that really buzz around this energy, this enthusiasm. And he's not just being thuggish there. Yes, he's threatening the mayor of Leicester. But in Rupert's defence, Parliament are plundering and taking money and estates from any royalist that they call a delinquent. So what Rupert's doing, he's simply doing the reverse of that. He's going to parliamentarian estates. He's going to parliamentarian towns. He's demanding money. He's taking money, same as they are. It's just he's painted as the foreign interloper, perhaps because of his birth, He gets the Royalist cause to a point where it can win the war. And I think that's the record that he should be judged on, that he's got that cause to a point of potential victory at Edgehill, that they've even been able to fight Edgehill. He then takes it right through to 1643, where he captures Bristol, and the Royalists are really in the ascent. And unfortunately, it's out of his control that the direction of the war, he's overruled. And that advantage that he's worked so hard to achieve slips away, especially when the Scots join the war in 1644. And of course, from then, he really does start to suffer. He's suffering because he's fighting a double war. He's fighting the Parliamentarians. He's fighting Royalist councillors who are much more cautious, who don't want to perhaps win by conquest. And that takes its toll, and he's not at his best in 1644 to 45. He does end up riding off the field, but that's a side effect of these furious charges. He can't control his men when they have smashed down into the enemy and kept their fire until they're in amongst them. It's hard to sort of rein his troops back in. But he doesn't go off plundering. He doesn't go off killing women and children, as it said. He tries his best to get them back to the field, but unfortunately, he's only playing a small role in that battle.
If one were to look at the most significant player in the Royalist army, so it sounds like really it's a sort of game of two halves. First half, it's Rupert, but then his influence is slightly, it sort of, as you say, it's kind of rescinds. And is this where we see George Digby, the Earl of Bristol, sort of emerge and become a more significant player? And I don't think the two got on, did they?
Absolutely not. I found I was somewhat surprised that the rivalry that is infamous between the two of them, it heats up real bad in 1644. But that's actually there almost as soon as Rupert's landed in England in 1642. There is friction there. So to me, reading a particular letter, for example, that's dated in Nottingham, so not around the time that the King's Standard's been raised, there's friction there which must have been pre-existent from Holland, because Rupert and Digby were in Holland for a time with the Queen. So something's happened. The two of them are not kindred spirits at all. They are opposites of each other. Rupert is no politician. Digby is a brilliant politician. Rupert is very blunt. He wears his feelings on his sleeve. Digby is very cunning and cautious. And Rupert doesn't know what to do to handle someone like that. He can't play him at his own game. Digby, the Battle of Newbury, the first Battle of Newbury in September 43, that's the point where Digby, who is an officer in the army, this is where one of the King's Secretaries of State is killed at Newbury. And the King promotes Digby into that place, which effectively moves him into a political role. And that's the most disastrous thing that he does, because Digby is constantly undermining Rupert. And as I say, that just builds up into, with devastating consequences. It leads to Rupert's dismissal.
Well, yes, this is by his own uncle, Charles. The two, as you've mentioned, have got this kind of close relationship. But Charles ends up kicking him out of England.
He does, yes. He never goes to as far as to actually enact that. So he revokes Rupert's commissions, and this comes in 1645 when Rupert surrenders Bristol. Now, prior to the surrender of Bristol, Rupert is telling the king that he thinks there's nothing left but to make an honourable peace. And that is really devastating to the king, because when you look at Charles, there's the man and the monarch. And to the man, he even puts this in a letter. He says, as a man, I know that there's a certainty of his ruin. But he says, as a monarch, and with his belief in God, he cannot believe that God will allow rebels to prosper. So the monarch, as a monarch, he can't believe that he will end up ruined. He can't allow, and he doesn't want to be surrounded by anyone that is defeatist. So when Rupert gives this advice, it really shakes the king to his core. He gets the letter in South Wales. Rupert at that point is heading for Bristol, so he's not with the king. And it's glorious for Digby, because this is what he plays on. He says, look, here's the evidence. Rupert, his brothers in London, in your bed, your majesty, in Whitehall Palace, sleeping in your bed, courting Parliament and MPs, courting the enemy. And he is the younger brother, Rupert, in command of your troops, and now he's telling you to make peace. So, he's just as bad as his brother. And the king sleeps on this message. He sleeps on the letter from Rupert. The next day, he writes a letter to Rupert, reaffirming his position, saying, speak no more of treaties, Rupert. I need people that will be willing to stand or fall alongside me. And that letter is sent to Rupert. But when I've done some digging into the archives, there's some coded letters, partly coded letters, which I've used to build up cipher keys between various Royalist correspondence. And there was a particular letter that was coded, which I then used these ciphers on. And it was just quite amazing, because it shows that we always thought, and history books have always said, Rupert asks the king to surrender, gives his advice, the king stands firm, and Rupert goes along with that. And Rupert accepts the king's position. Well, there's a letter from the time when Rupert took up his command as governor of Bristol in 1645. He's written that letter to the king. He then gets the response. And this coded letter, when you unlock it, it's telling the king, or it's telling Rupert's good friend, Will Legge. It's telling William Legge that he still disagrees with the king's advice. And he reiterates that there's no way the king can save his posterity but by a treaty. And I think that's very telling, because that's Rupert's mindset. He's in command of the second city in the kingdom, really the last hope. Now the king completely trusts Rupert all the way through, even when they fall out. He never loses that love for his nephew. But if he's going to fight on to the end, I think what the king thinks is he must have people with him who believe that he can still win. And Rupert, as we see with that second newly quoted letter, Rupert doesn't believe that the king can win. And, you can't really blame Charles, I don't think, for actually saying, well, perhaps this is the time for Rupert to go. And for the Royalist cause to continue to fight on without him. So there's justification there, and that's what Digby plays on. That's just what he wants, and then he takes the remainder of the Royalist forces and cruises them to defeat.
Well, yes, we know what happens to the Royalist forces, but what happens to Rupert?
So he's in Oxford. He's with there is a big dispute between him and the king. There's a lot of people that see Digby as a traitor, as a malign or malignant influence. And they confront the king in Newark in 1645. And this is Rupert is extremely rude. He doesn't pay the king due respect. He bursts in when he's at supper. He interrupts another mealtime. The king says, I fancy that this looks very much like rebellion with Rupert and his followers. And, one of them says the wrong thing. They really, really don't endear themselves at all. And the king offers passes for them all to leave the country. Rupert takes his, but he never actually does anything with it. So the king in Oxford, in the last days before ultimate military defeat, he's wondering, well, why isn't Rupert leaving the country? I've given him the pass. Parliament then give Rupert a pass to leave. They are happy for him to leave, and he doesn't. So you've got king and Parliament wondering, what is this prince doing? What's he aiming at? What's his plan? And Rupert, Royalists are begging Rupert, do not leave your uncle. Don't leave your uncle. Will Legge, who is his greatest friend, he says, the king, King Charles I, he is as much of a father as anyone to you. Don't leave him in his hour of need. And he doesn't. And eventually they make up. And when Charles I surrenders to the Scots in 1646, Rupert offers to go with them, but the king says no. His great height, as the king says, will give them away. So Rupert stays in Oxford, and when Oxford surrenders, he's given a pass to leave, and this time he takes it, and he goes to France.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. In many ways, this is where his life gets really interesting, doesn't it? Yeah. I mean, it's obviously leading cavalry charges is very exciting, but he's a lot more than just a cavalry commander, isn't he?
He is, yes. So he's fighting. So he's commanding all the English under the command of the King of France. He's shot in the head fighting the Spanish with those forces. Then he becomes an admiral. So we've got a small nucleus of a fleet that defect from the Royal Navy, Parliament's Royal Navy. They come over to the Royalist cause. Rupert is given command. And he toils for months to get this small fleet ready for sea, supplied. And he takes them on this epic voyage, so he goes from Holland to Ireland to Portugal, the Mediterranean, the Azores, and eventually over to the West Indies. He nearly drowns. He loses his flagship. He nearly goes down with the ship. He survives. But then in the West Indies, his brother is lost to a storm, and Maurice doesn't survive.
That's his younger brother. How much was he affected by his? Because the two seem quite close.
They were extremely close. Yeah, they are. They were the closest. Rupert's closest sibling was Maurice. They'd been through so much together. They'd fought the whole Civil War together, and he's devastated. There's times in this voyage where Maurice's ship gets blown off course, and Rupert does think that Maurice is dead, and Maurice turns up. He turns up in port, overjoyed, that they're not, they've survived. And I think when Maurice does get lost and the storm claims him, Rupert doesn't believe initially that it's happened. He thinks that yet again, somehow Maurice is just going to sail into port and say, yeah, I've just been blown off course again. And then you have a lot of stories that come back that Maurice is a prisoner in a Spanish castle. He's been captured by pirates. And these stories just perpetuate the belief that he's still alive. But then you sort of start to get, after 5 years, I think they know that it's highly unlikely that he's alive.
But what was the purpose of being in the West Indies? Because obviously they're not doing this for England anymore.
Yeah, well, he's literally keeping the Royalist flag flying at sea. So the Royalists have lost the kingdom. The Commonwealth are in place. They are quashing the Scots and the Irish. Really, Rupert's galloping along the seas in his ships the same way, from the quarterdeck, the same way as he'd charge along a battlefield. And his hopes, apart from taking prize ships, which can get sent back to the exiled court, Prince Charles, and then King Charles II, once his father's executed. These are, he's supplying little bits of money here and there, enough to survive. But what he hopes is that he could either influence some of the English colonies, and stop them falling to the Commonwealth forces. So he could maybe attack the Commonwealth Navy to stop them claiming these. Or he could capture perhaps the East India Fleet and raid that. And he fails on both accounts. But it's a grueling voyage that leaves Rupert broken almost when he gets back to France.
What does he do for the remainder of his career? Because you see evidence of his name all over the world, really, but particularly in Canada.
I think when you asked that first question at the start about why does he endure today, this is one of the reasons. And it's because not just the propaganda, not because of this flamboyant, brave, aggressive military man. It's also because he's woven into every fabric of the 17th century. He's very creative. So he's not just a soldier, he's a sailor. He produces very good mezzotint engravings. He's a very good artist. He's a scientist. He produces inventions, noiseless muskets, applications that could heal an incision to a pig's gut. He produces potions and lotions. Prince Rupert's drop, which is like a tadpole-shaped piece of glass. You hit one end, it doesn't shatter. You tap the other one, and it goes into powder. And that's something similar to car windscreens. How they are strengthened today. So all of these things, they keep him. You pick up a book about an aspect of the 17th century, the chances are that Rupert's contributed in some way to that, whether it's science, art, engineering. He looked for a way of making a ship cannon-proof. You've got his guns that were iron cast to sort of calibers that would make them lighter, cheaper, more maneuverable. How to colour marble. There's so much to him, to that man.
Did you find more when writing this? Did you find more than you expected? I mean, you mentioned as well the amount of research you found, primary research in archives, but was there more to? I mean, there was always a lot to Rupert, but was there more?
There was, yeah, definitely, because we've talked about Royalist propaganda and Parliamentarian propaganda, but there's also material that has, because sometimes, particularly with the first battle of his life at Vlotho, there's not much material accessible to historians to write about that battle. And that one, for example, the details that are used on the primary sources are glorifying Rupert. They are they're almost biographical notes that have been written later after that battle. And they've been used to describe the battle. So naturally, Rupert comes out of it extremely well. And actually, you can see that he didn't particularly excel in certain aspects of that, but it's covered up. So it's finding actually his strengths and his weaknesses, the good and the bad, the man. And I think that's another reason why he endures so much. It's because he's I think I mentioned it in the article, he's a human hero. People look at him because he's good looking, he's gritty, determined, but also they know his faults and they can relate to his faults. We've all got faults. And, he like Philip, again, we come back to Philip. Rupert was extremely blunt speaking, just like Philip, but he was very dedicated. And I think people respect that, and they can see that he's more human.
And this is during the interregnum. He's had much of his naval career.
I think it sort of scratches the surface in the interregnum because he's only got a very small fleet, sometimes just one or two ships even.
So what's he doing for much of the interregnum?
Well, and this is very interesting as well, because you see how broken he is when he comes back to France after that voyage where he loses his brother. He then gets reabsorbed into Royalist politics, but then he goes through a period where he's looking to settle down, and he wants to settle in the Palatinate, where his brother's just been reestablished in the Lower Palatinate at least, so half of it. He's looking for an estate, a house, where he can settle down. He falls out with his brother, and he vows never to go back to the Palatinate, and he never does. And at this point, so during that time before the Restoration, he goes through, I think, these creative moments. So I think Rupert is such an energetic guy that he often doesn't have the time to be creative. That changes after the Restoration, but certainly at that point, he's been fighting non-stop since 1642, or over 10 years. I think his body and his mind need a rest. And this is where he starts to experiment with mezzotint engraving. This is where he creates ideas and sort of inventions. He's observing military matters. It's given him the rest and the recuperation that he needs. And then he goes out looking for service with the Holy Roman Emperor. And then Charles II's restored. So he manages to get permission to come out of that service and goes back to England. And, that's it. From that point, he wants to settle.
England's always a pull for him then?
It is, yeah. He never, even though Charles I's executed, he's always attempting to serve Charles II or advise or put in a good word with the emperor, negotiate. He's still, even in the 1650s, he's still put forward as a possible commander for Royalist uprisings in Scotland. He's not the most popular of choices by the Scots, but certainly he's in the mix. And for Rupert, that's what matters. He wants to do something. He wants to get revenge on his uncle's murderers.
But once he returns to England after the Restoration in 1660, then I guess his military skills are really applied with the Royal Navy as opposed to...
They are, very much, yeah. So he does take a role in defences, so he's looking at defences for Portsmouth, that sort of thing. He's reinforcing Chatham during the Dutch wars, to prevent them from sailing up the Thames again. But yeah, primarily he's there. He's a senior commander of the Royal Navy against the Dutch in the Dutch wars, and he comes off very well with that. There's moments where the fleet don't do particularly well, heavy losses, but Rupert's personal valour is never in question. He's on the quarterdeck, and he's leading almost again. Like I said, he's in the saddle, but he's on the quarterdeck. He's leading his ships, and he develops this technique where he cuts right through the Dutch formations, almost like cavalry charges, charging straight through. He cuts right through the Dutch,
like Nelson did at Trafalgar.
Yes, yeah.
With mention of the Royal Navy, and of course Samuel Pepys, the diarist, who was quite a senior civil servant for the Royal Navy, I think. Yes. Did the two have a relationship?
You could say that. Yes.
He divided opinion, didn't he, Rupert?
He certainly did, yeah. I mean, Rupert was no friend of civil servants, I don't think. He put them through their paces. He didn't... You can almost imagine sort of, a Margaret Thatcher figure who's taken no prisoners with civil servants. I think Rupert would have seen Pepys and his shore-based administrators as sort of wets, you know. he argued with them. There's rumours that Rupert even raised his cane to one of Charles II's ministers. But he had Pepys quaking in his boots in meetings. And to the point where Pepys is trying to backtrack on something that he said. He says the fleet, England never put out such a good fleet for it to come home in such a bad state. And Rupert fires into this rage because he's been on these vessels buffeted by wind and rain. The Dutch, he's been fighting, watching people getting mauled and shot to ribbons by wooden shards. And then he is a civil servant saying the fleet's come back in a terrible state. And Pepys, he's not exactly saying, that it's Rupert's fault, but Rupert is a passionate person, and he really
he's not going to take any admonishment from a pen pusher who hasn't spent much time at sea.
No, I mean, when Rupert, the thing is, he gets a taste of it because there's a point when the Duke of York's in command of the fleet, and Rupert is ashore, and Rupert takes command of the Admiralty. So he's getting the civil servants, the Navy Board, assembling them in his rooms at Whitehall Palace at 9 a.m. prompt, and he's given them a list of questions. They've got to answer this. How many fire ships do we have? How many ships have we got ready? Give me a list of the complement of the crew. So he really pulls the organisation side of things into, he takes no prisoners.
Amazing stuff, really. I mean, it's an extraordinary life. Because he died in 1671.
Or 1682.
1682. He's serving Charles II for sort of 20 odd years after the Restoration.
Yes, yeah.
What were his sort of most significant achievements then towards the end of his life?
I think the Dutch wars, and he was Vice Admiral of England in the end. His naval service definitely is one of the biggest achievements. But I think with Rupert, the sort of unsaid achievement would have to be his Protestantism. So I think when you've got the Duke of York converting to Catholicism, which means he has to give up the Lord High Admiralship. You've got King Charles II flirting with Catholicism. He's always trying to make an alliance with Louis of France. Rupert in command of the Navy, Rupert at the Navy Board, Rupert in the Privy Council, Rupert in the House of Lords, Rupert on advisory committees in Parliament. He's a Protestant beacon of trust. And, that Rupert doesn't hold back in his advice to Charles II. For example, there's one point when Charles is trying to manage a difficult situation with Parliament, and there are many, to be fair to Charles II. And Rupert says, he's advised him against ending Parliament. You'll not be done until you follow your father's end. Quite blunt advice to Charles II. And there's only Rupert, cousin Rupert, who could give that sort of advice, I'm sure. So, he's making Protestant alliances. He's pushing for a marriage between Mary and William of Orange, so the Duke of York's daughter. He's pushing for that, which severely upsets King Louis. So, yeah, he's there pushing Protestant alliances. And he even, which I found really interesting, that Rupert's pushing for a marriage alliance between Anne, which is the second daughter of the Duke of York, a Protestant Anne, and Rupert's sister's son, George. Now, both of these do become monarchs in their own right, but Rupert, until his last year, is pushing for a marriage between Anne and George to try and, breed a Protestant super heir. He's aware of the chasm that's coming, and perhaps he has an inkling of what might occur.
The establishment of the Hanoverians was in part down to his kind of pulling of strings years before.
So it doesn't come off, but what he wants to do is to unite these two branches So in effect, that would unite Charles I's branch with Rupert's mother's branch, Protestant, most importantly.
Yeah.
The Hanoverians come about anyway because Anne takes the throne. She doesn't leave a child to inherit the throne, and it does pass to George. But perhaps if those two were matched as Rupert was pushing, who knows, they may have had a child that could have inherited. And you've got a Hanoverian Stuart mix, I suppose.
It's an extraordinary life. It really is. And this is a lot. You found a lot of primary material, haven't you? In the archives. Where in particular did you find most of your sort of new information?
Such a selection. So, I mean, there's 24 archives in the UK that I've consulted, and there's big parts of the National Archives, the British Library, naturally, because they're big, but the local archives are extremely important as well. And it's the local archives that turned up, for example, and this is one thing that I'm really pleased about, is the women in Rupert's life. They've never been in the stories. They've never been in there. They're just a shadow. Mistresses, that's what they're called, mistresses. Nothing else but in his bedroom. Well, that's absolutely wrong. This union of Anne and George that he was working at wasn't just him that was working at that. His mistress, as we say, or I'm going to call her Rupert's life partner, because the last woman that he had a relationship with, Margaret Hughes, Peg Hughes, one of the first actresses on the stage, she and Rupert together pushed this match. You know, and this shows that he trusted her implicitly with politics, but also family affairs. And George I, George, who became George I, he even wrote to Peg in her own right, and thanked her for all of the advice that she'd given. Even though Anne didn't want the match, George had said, "Well, thank you for everything you've done. I'll never forget it. I'm very grateful to you. You and Uncle Rupert, I'm very grateful to them." So yeah, Peg played such a big part in Rupert's life. She gave him the family life, I think, and the domestic bliss, I think, that he wanted. I mean, they never married, no, and they didn't live together full time, but they had a daughter together, and it's the whole about the women in his life tell us so much about Rupert. So there was another which was quite amazing. I'd looked at Civil War letters from Rupert in 1645, and I'm reading a letter, and there were just maybe about a couple of words that made no sense. And then I found a reference, which was a known reference in John Evelyn's diary, that there was a rumour Rupert had fathered a child in the Civil War. And that was a post-restoration rumour in Evelyn's diary. Nobody, one biography had said there's no tangible link between Rupert and the mother of this child. And then in this letter, it suddenly dawned on me that Rupert is talking about her in this letter. And just a few words that links Rupert with her. And then I looked into that family's archive in one of the local archives in England. And boy, that turned up letters about this, details about this child that was born, when, where, how, the rumours that went around after it, which was something else. Quite amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's well done you on finding all this new stuff. This is fantastic. And so, listeners, links are in the show notes, and you've got some great reviews and some great endorsements as well on for the book as well. Ronald Hutton. And
I'm so grateful to Ronald Hutton. I mean, he the amount of work, his workload in the day job, and he was so kind to sort of read the manuscript before publication and give the endorsement. And Professor Nadine Ackerman, again, and her work of transcribing and translating Rupert's mother's letters, that was another aspect which hadn't been available before, which was so useful to incorporate into the book. And she was kind enough for the endorsement. And then not forgetting Adrian Tinniswood as well, who wrote the brilliant book about the Verneys, which I read when I was young. Excellent book. So yeah, over the moon.
Well, fully deserved. But Mark, this has been great. Thanks so much for coming on. And of course, there's your piece on historical heroes. Rupert of the Rhine. I mean, perfect historical hero. But thanks very much for coming on, and best of luck with the book.
Thanks so much, Ollie. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.